Hello, everyone. This is Connie Silva-Broussard. Thank you for joining us. You are on the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project webinar. One of the first things you've likely noticed is we have changed our platform for these webinars. Excuse me. So if you've joined us in the past, it may look a little different, but it should more or less feel like a similar experience for you. We're using chat. We're using some simple polls today, so it shouldn't feel like anything too different, and hopefully your logging on was easy. We are, as always, recording this session, and so everything, including chat and the audio and visual, will be available later online if you choose to review some of the information that was provided. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Sorry so much for the slight delay in our begin time. We're very, very happy to have you all here. I have the SPP-TAP team around the room here with me, and we have our presenter, Dr. Frances Stetson, ready to go in Texas. So we'll talk with her in just a little bit. I just quickly want to go over a couple preliminary slides. One is to remind you, those of you who know already, some of the things that we have available to you, and those who don't, just quickly do a run-through of what our project provides. We are funded by the California Department of Education, and we provide a variety of technical assistance support to districts in California around addressing disproportionality. And some of the ways that we do that you'll see on this slide here. We have a community of practice that we do for districts, specifically those that are identified as significantly disproportionate. We do webinars like we're doing today, and those are for anyone who's interested in hearing about the topics that were presented. So you don't need to be in disproportionality or significant disproportionality to take advantage of these resources. We also have the website, which again has resources that are available to anyone, and obviously that's not limited to California, but the information for the most part is tied to the processes that we use here in California. And of course, you can always ask for assistance. You have my website, my email address, and also George Trias, our director. His email address is on the slide. They're also very present on the website, and our phone numbers as well. So you're always welcome to contact us. Okay. Now, sorry. Can you guys move the slide for me? Okay, so I have a little bit to say about our next webinar. It's on December 1st, and we have not opened registration for this, but we have a wonderful presenter and topic, so I want to let you know about it, and you could mark your calendars now and save the date. So December 1st from 3 p.m., that's not our typical time, but we have Aaron Zisser, who's on the East Coast, so this is a better time for him on December 1st from 3 to 4:30 p.m. And Aaron is a former U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division attorney. So he's going to be presenting information on federal enforcement around disproportionality. That will include things like the Department of Justice and the Office of Civil Rights Statutory Authority, the agency's approach to investigations, and the current trends and priorities, including recent examples of agency guidance, investigations, and consent decrees or resolution agreements. And also provide some resources for guidance and other materials. So I think it's going to be a very interesting webinar, and again, you're all welcome to join us. When we open up registration, we would welcome your participation in that webinar as well. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Dr. Frances Stetson, and she'll turn her camera on in just a minute. And she has, obviously, will tell you a little bit about herself. Her presentation, you'll see, is very engaging, and she's very willing to share different pieces of her past background and experience. But what I do want to let you know is Dr. Frances Stetson is the president of Stetson and Associates. That's an educational consulting firm specializing in supporting systems change in schools with a focus on inclusive practices and closing the achievement gap, differentiated instruction, and quality standards for instruction and leadership. She's also the executive director and sponsor for the Inclusive Schools Network, and that's a website that offers free resources and blogs and articles. It's a very, very wonderful website, and one of the top 5 websites on inclusive education. Frances began her career as a teacher of students with visual disabilities, and she'll tell you a little bit more about her path and the work that she's done. And under her current association, her agency, she and her staff have supported thousands of school districts and state departments in implementing quality education services across the United States. We're very fortunate to have her with us today, and we know that you will love the information that she's going to provide. I want to just quickly say that as part of this registration and confirmation, you should have also received some links, and you'll see them right there in the chat box. There's some wonderful resources that she's provided, and she'll certainly be talking about some of those. You won't necessarily have the time to go through all of them while we're talking today, but do visit them, copy and paste them so that you have them for yourself, and visit them later. There's wonderful resources there. Okay, so with that, I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Stetson. Welcome, Dr. Stetson. Please remember to press star 6 so that we can all hear you.
All right, well, let's test it. I did press star 6. Am I on?
You are. We hear you loud and clear.
All right. Thank you, Connie, very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I've been looking forward to this webinar for some time. Well, let's start by looking at, of course, the whole notion of combining and looking at disproportionality through the lens of inclusive education. And I, stepped back a little bit into history to prepare for this session, and I was looking at all the tremendous commonalities. There's almost one and the same in terms of sharing concepts and promises for children and families, and certainly we know both of them of not being included in the least restrictive environment, and for children also for equity to be present when we're making decisions about whether or not they're even eligible for or in need of special education. Because certainly within disproportionality, we're concerned that we are over-identifying. The other concept I think that's very important is that of belonging. Everyone has the right or the joy of feeling as though they belong. And in the old language of the schools, we're either a member of the classroom or we're an outsider or we're a visitor. And the last piece, when we look at inclusion itself, I think the words included and excluded are very powerful for us to think about in terms of children and in terms of the community that we need to create in all of our schools. So when looking at this, I will tell you that, as Connie said, I began my career in a very, very small area and very, very focused. I taught blind children who were blind and partially sighted. And so that was my world. Those classrooms were my world. And so I really did focus on the delivery of services to children who had a disability and were eligible to receive them. And over time in my career, leaving after a time the classroom and becoming a researcher and a consultant, I have many opportunities to go in and out of really hundreds of classrooms every year. And so certainly early on in my career, I began noticing something. When I would go into a school, I would go into the classrooms that had children that were more excluded, that were in self-contained classrooms, or even classrooms that were not even part of the school. They were in a portable building or maybe in another building entirely. And there's something that you notice when you go in the more self-contained classrooms, the farthest end of a continuum in terms of settings for children of any sort to receive their services. And that was that not only did I see children with disabilities in more of those segregated and pull-out sort of situations, but I also began to notice that the racial or cultural composition of those classrooms was decidedly leaning toward minority children, children of poverty. And so when you begin noticing things like that, even if you are an educator that's really focused so tightly on your own area of expertise, you begin to realize that you cannot be concerned about equity for some children without being concerned about equity for all children. And so it piqued my interest. It actually made me uncomfortable when I began to see these patterns. And so then the rest of my career has been more inclusive in the sense of inclusive for all children. So that's what we're going to look at today in this presentation, or the juxtaposition between those two interests and how they relate and what some of the strategies are. I wanted to start with a definition that's on your screen of inclusion, and I have the phrase at the top: inclusion is for everyone, or is it? Which kind of mirrored my personal experiences. When you look at the pie chart, I actually had pulled the pie chart pieces for children of color and students with disabilities away from that total circle, because we also know not only were my own observations worrying me, but we also knew that we started looking at more and more of the data, we started seeing that we in fact really did have a concern. What I found really, really fascinating and reinforcing getting ready for this presentation was a trip down memory lane in terms of Brown versus Board of Education. Of course, signed a court case that came about and was decided in 1954, in which it was found that segregated schools are inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. Well, what was interesting to me is that because my background had always been special education, that I read a lot recently about the fact that Brown versus Board of Education stimulated the thinking among parents of children with disabilities to say, you know, that same concept ought to apply to our children too. And so it gave the parents courage, it gave them legal leverage and some guidance in pressing for what was passed in 1975, the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, as it was known at the time, or IDEA, as we know it today, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so it was about, 20 years apart, but what the Brown case really did stimulate and propel all that we know about children with disabilities. So again, another relationship. Now, the reason I had those two pie pieces that were separate from the total pie chart of inclusion is that we have some disturbing data today that tells us, let's start with children with disabilities, that after 9 years of collecting this data, certainly it's been collected for many, many years, but the most recent annual report to Congress had a longitudinal study that they looked at. And in the past 9 years, there's only been an 11% increase in the percentage of students with disabilities who are actually educated all or at least 80% of their day inside the general ed classroom. So we have made progress, but we haven't made resounding progress at all. And as a matter of fact, at the same time that statistic has gone up 11%. In a troubling way, the percentage of youngsters who are in the most segregated settings is actually beginning to increase again. So we're seeing some spring back in terms of that inclusive practices. Now, let's look at that then in terms of children of color and disproportionality. Certainly, we have a significant problem in our schools today in terms of disproportionality. And also troubling is the fact that our minority children are subjected to higher rates of exclusionary discipline. In other words, the disciplinary action, and we'll talk about some studies later on in our session here, but disciplinary issues or behaviors of children are seen to be more egregious if they're committed by minority children, even if it's exact same infraction of the behavior rules. So there's a much tougher standard that's operating. And of course, one of the biggest concerns of all, whether we're at lack of inclusion or we're being disproportionately identified and served in special education programs, is that truly does represent inequitable opportunities to learn. It is an issue that we're going to look at in just a few minutes in terms of strategies where we need to significantly increase the quality of those instructional practices. But it's true that I believe we still have to say that we have much, much work to do in both of these regards. Okay, now this is a very strong passion on my part, and that is it's a tendency for many folks to say, well, let's look at inclusion and disproportionality, and let's look at the strategies that we can put in place in the classroom. And we have to do that. That's very important. But I am convinced after my work in this regard for so many years that there's some work we have to do first before we even start thinking about adjusting our instructional practices. And that work is understanding at a deeper level why we continue to have problems around lack of inclusive practices and the increase and the continuing issues of disproportionality in the country. Now, I've put three descriptors there about both of those practices. The problems are significant, they are persistent, they have been in place for 20, 30, 40 years, or way longer, and they are pervasive. This is not just a problem in one part of the country or necessarily in one part of a particular state. They are pervasive problems. So we have got to first understand why are we not seeing the successes and the reduction of some of these negative practices for children. So I'm going to share with you a book and two authors that have really made a difference for me in my career in looking and understanding the phenomena. It's Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky. This is their earliest book in this area, but they've written a whole bunch of them past 2002. But I wanted to source their original work in this area. And what the book was all about was talking about understanding change in organizations and change in individuals, and why some of our problems seem so intractable. So the authors have presented two thoughts about a particular change problem. That would inclusion be a change we're after? You bet. Would elimination of disproportionality be a problem? Yes. So the authors tell us there are actually two kinds of problems, if you just the most basic sense. The first kind of problem is just a technical problem. We already know the information about how to solve it. We already have strategies. It's simply the matter of getting it done. And I'll give you an example. In schools today, one of the biggest problems we have is finding and using planning time well, so that our colleagues can sit down together, develop lessons, determine which roles belong to whom, if we're having more collaborative teaching practices, and so on. But the need to find and use well collaborative planning time is truly essential. Now, do we know how to do better with planning time? Do we know how to use it better? Do we know strategies for reconstructing our schedules, our school schedules, so that we have more time? You bet we do. In fact, if you want to look it up and you just Google it, to use a word, and put effective instructional planning time, you will find hundreds of different strategies that exist that are in place across schools in this country and around the world in terms of addressing that problem. So our authors call that a technical problem. Technical meaning we already have the know-how and the ability to solve it. We just need to get it done. But what they present that really makes so much sense for me, and I imagine it will for you, and that is the whole notion of the other kind of change problem, and that they called adaptive challenges. Now, an adaptive challenge isn't simple. There isn't a whole list of strategies for fixing that problem. What adaptive challenges are, as our slide says, is they're problems that require changes of attitude, values, and behavior. That sounds an awful lot like the two problems that challenges that we're talking about in this session, because these are truly attitudinal changes, levels of acceptance, levels of personal knowledge about our own attitudes and how they affect our practice. I think it's interesting that second bullet says that adaptive challenges are problems that just aren't amenable to authority saying, you will just go do this, or that's the standard operating procedure, just follow it. So one of the things that we want to say is what's the difference between a technical and an adaptive, and we want to say when we look at our two problems, which are they? So I'd like to invite the audience to kind of put your heads around this and look at our two problems, our two challenges. Is solving and increasing inclusion and decreasing the level of disproportionality, is that simply a technical problem, or is that an adaptive challenge? So if you will, vote and enter your poll votes, and let's see what the answers are. Oh, good. Very excellent. I'll wait just a minute while you're voting, and we'll have a chance to report back to you in just a few minutes. So is it a technical problem? Are they technical problems? Are they adaptive challenges, or are they both? Okay. Please continue to vote, but I will say that I'm in agreement with the responses. Largely, I would say, personally, that these two issues that we're talking about today are truly adaptive challenges. They bring up issues of racism, of prejudice, low expectations, and so on. But for those of you, the majority of you have said it's actually both. And the reason I agree with that vote today, and I might not have agreed with it a few years ago, is that today we have a lot of strategies and practices to put in place that really do make progress toward inclusion and reduction of disproportionality. So we have the votes here that almost 67%, two-thirds of you, think that they actually have some elements of both the technical and the adaptive. And about a third of you are saying overall it's basically an adaptive challenge because it's one of the heart and of the head. So that's very helpful, and it's really good to begin thinking about it because I'm going to ask you another question now. I'm going to take you to our next question. On a scale of 1 to 5 now, rate the level of difficulty in increasing inclusive ed and eliminating disproportionality. From 1 is very simple, 5 is like earth-shaking kind of problem. In other words, it could be solved tomorrow, or it is a problem that will be with us for the next, say, 20, 30, 40 years even. Okay, so I'm seeing your votes come in. All right. The rest of you, I hope you'll vote. How difficult is this going to be to solve these problems? All right. There's a small percentage, 15%, that think it's a 5, earth-shaking. And then you're almost evenly divided between a 3 and a 4. Okay. Very good. Nobody gave this a 1 or a 2, at least not yet. So we all know this is not going to be easy. And in fact, most of our votes tend to be, over half of them tend to be a 4 or a 5. So let's keep that in mind then when we start looking at some of the strategies I brought you this afternoon so that we can think about how we in fact approach this, because most assuredly it's a difficult problem. If it was not so difficult, we would have solved this since 1954, or we would have solved it since 1975. But here we are with the challenges we face. So let me talk to you just quickly about how we want to organize the information that we have for you this afternoon. We have 3 different components of the session today, and I want to start with the changes that are necessary regarding our own personal awareness and attitudes. Then we're going to talk about the changes in the classroom. And finally, we're going to talk about necessary changes in leadership. So let's get started. All right. In the first one, we're going to be talking at a level that I think is so essential, because I have noticed something. If all we talk about are the technical solutions, how to increase academic learning time or student engagement or more opportunities for faculties to talk about the challenges of inclusion and disproportionality, if we only focus on the technical and we don't take time to really look at the adaptive piece, which means that's of the head and the heart, and individuals' personal philosophies and biases and prejudice, and pull all of that out of the closet so that we can look at that in a very direct way. If we don't do that, then all the other little fixes that we identify are not going to be as effective. In fact, they might likely not even be implemented at all, because I can give lip service to the fact that it needs to change, but I may not necessarily go to the implementation level that is required in order to really make a change in these practices. Now, one of the things that I think is a really important concept here is that, therefore, if I'm working with a group of educators or community personnel or families or what have you, on these topics, I always begin by looking at self-knowledge, self-reflection, so that you have some sense of your own, what you bring to the classroom or what you bring to the community in the way of your own cultural leanings, and how that impacts your ability or your teaching style or your interaction style with individuals who are different from you. So the term increasing our comfort zone is one that I often use, and I want to take just a minute with it because I think it's an adult responsibility. I imagine for any of you who've ever been on a road trip with your wife or your husband, your spouse, or a significant other, you've had some kind of similar experience. My husband and I, some years ago, were driving off on a road trip, and I said in just a few minutes, "Wow, it's really hot in here. Could you turn the air conditioner higher? It's just so hot, just really burning up." And so Jerry did, and so about 5 miles down the road, I said, "Wow, this is really cold. How cold did you turn that up? You need to make it a little warmer in here." And after a few of those conversations as we went down the road, Jerry said to me, "Frances, you need to increase your comfort zone. Your comfort zone is very narrow. It's probably within 1 to 2 degree temperature degrees." And we laughed, and it was sort of a funny story at the time, but then later I've thought a lot about that concept. So part of what we're after here for ourselves and for our colleagues is to increase our comfort zone with diversity, with different cultures, different races, different languages, and we have to do that in order for us to be effective in our roles. And so it's a conscious effort to increase our comfort zone. So here we're going to work on a few things that should increase our comfort zone. I think one of the things I want to share with you is a Nelson Mandela quotation. Certainly he was such a well-known leader in all regards, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. But look at this phrase and how relevant it is for us in what we're talking about today. He says, "The first thing is to be honest with yourself. You can never have an impact on society if you have not changed yourself." So there are a lot of folks that want to talk about disproportionality, but may in fact not really be making any changes that support that. And I could say the same for inclusive education. So I have the 3 categories here of topics that I'm going to discuss very quickly. Certainly if you want to know more about these, you'll want to study these, get some books on them, watch other webinars that take this in a deeper route. I know that that this wonderful group from California has other webinars that they've produced that deal in more depth with these topics. So we have to get more acquainted with ourselves and our organizations and looking at cultural proficiency. I want to point out this definition is really powerful. It allows individuals and organizations to interact effectively with people who differ from them. We have both challenges to work with, both ourselves and our organization. Okay, so in order to do that, there are 3 topics that I like to bring to an audience's attention. Now, many of you in this audience could probably teach this and probably do teach these subjects. And maybe for some of you, this may be new. This is going to be a quick review so that we can talk about how important this first piece is and looking at our own attitudes and our own practices. So let's go a little further, and I want to pick first the cultural proficiency continuum. Now, I'm going to be very honest and tell you that it wasn't until really about 10 years ago that I even knew of a cultural proficiency continuum. Lindsay and Robbins and Terrell have a great book called Cultural Proficiency, A Manual for School Leaders. And that was the first book that I read, trying to make some sense out of what I was seeing in schools and in classrooms. And if you notice, there's a continuum on the scale. and it goes all the way from destructiveness to proficiency. And so my thought is that before we go much further, everyone, educators, community members, need to understand this framework. So let's talk first, too, about, as we look at the continuum from destructiveness to proficiency, notice that the lower part of the continuum begins with conflict and blame. It's a very unhealthy area to be, and we have an awful lot of folks who may actually be here simply because they haven't stretched their comfort zone. So it's a matter of adding some learning, some personal reflection. The more culturally proficient you are up this continuum, you have more empathy and you've done more learning about self and others in order to get there. Now, the next slide I'm going to do, right now just those words don't really make a lot of sense. So let's look quickly at some great definitions to help us know where they reside. Cultural destructiveness, negating, disparaging, or purging cultures that were different from your own. Now, I grew up in South Texas. Probably 90 to 95% of the inhabitants of my small town learned Spanish as their first language. English was their second. And yet in the schools that I went to, the students were told that if they were caught speaking in Spanish anywhere on the school grounds, they could be sent to some disciplinary action. Well, that's destructive. That's a very destructive kind of statement that says that what you grew up with, what your family is comfortable with in their own comfort zones are negative and must be purged from our culture. Similarly, we see that with children with disabilities and looking at inclusion. You see this with all populations that are of children who are different. And so we don't have children with disabilities in this school. They're really served down the street, or they're served in another school. We still see some of that behavior. Incapacity is an interesting one, too, because look at the definition of incapacity. Elevating the superiority of your cultural values and beliefs and suppressing those that are different. Here are a couple of statements that you hear from people who are at the incapacity level. I was shocked when I went to my son's high school graduation. Do you know the valedictorian and salutatorian were minority students? Incapacity, seeing a superiority of your own race. The other could be teachers looking at the scores of children with disabilities in the school and saying, I was shocked. They actually mastered the content. Incapacity. Up through blindness. Now, most of us have heard this level of cultural proficiency. People say, you know, I don't see any difference whether a person is black or brown or white. It doesn't matter. We all look the same to me. Well, that's still in the negative end of the continuum for sure, because what you're saying is I don't recognize and value the differences that are brought to our society, to our culture, and to our schools by having an array of different of representation of different cultures and races. So I don't even notice it. And you hear a lot of folks that make those statements. The next three in their descriptions are, well, we're moving up. The pre-conference competence is a great place to begin, and that is knowing what you don't know and being very interested in learning about other cultures, but you know your limitations, you recognize them, and you start your journey there in doing more readings, in talking with colleagues, with more diverse individuals and cultures, and trying to understand and respect and incorporate them. Then as you move to, and I have to say, I just returned from several weeks doing some work in Saudi Arabia. And there are a number of cultural issues and differences in terms of dress and respect and religion that you have to know. So when I went to their country, I knew immediately I was at a pre-confidence level because there was so much more I needed to learn and had engaged in a lot of experiences that hopefully are moving me into the confidence level there. But I still have growth to achieve in that regard. Now, competence and proficiency, are really interesting because if you notice the distinction in competence It's you are interacting with other cultural groups in ways that motivate you to assess your own skills and ultimately to change your behavior. So you're actively working at this point in terms of your cultural proficiency, and then when you finally achieve proficiency, that's the highest level. Well, these are very helpful because I've watched educators that I work with, when first introduced to this continuum, having some very honest and reflective conversations with themselves about where they are now, where they have been teaching and what level they've been practicing, and where they want to be and how they need to get there. So we have a question here for you, which is when you began your own journey toward cultural proficiency, and every one of us at this webinar are someplace along that continuum, where would you say, which of these levels best represents where you began? Everyone to think. This is a self-reflection. So reflecting for yourself, look and see, was I in the destructive, incapacity, blindness, pre-competence, competence, or proficiency? And then where are you now? Which stage are you in now? And then, what does that mean that you personally need to do in order to continue to raise your level of cultural proficiency? Now, I want to say also that it's a very important concept that every culture and every race has its own biases, and each individual. It's not that only a certain race has this continuum to address. It's every single one of us in this audience are somewhere along this continuum of our own cultural proficiency. So think for a minute how educators can raise their level of cultural proficiency. And while you're thinking about that, let me tell you my bias. Culturally proficient teachers are absolutely essential to schools today. And if we have a teacher operating in the negative end of that continuum, then they need to change their behaviors and their attitudes, or they need to be doing something else, because that's very destructive to students, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, well, you've done your self-reflection. Let's move to a really interesting next concept, not only of cultural proficiency and where you fall along that continuum, but another fascinating area. If you're not familiar with it, you will learn tremendous amounts, and if you are, you might enjoy revisiting it. It's the concept of white privilege. Now, what is that? All right, the first author that introduced this concept was Peggy McIntosh. It was written back in 1989. And she has written a wonderful, it was an article, and just Google it. Everybody can download it. It's for free. We may have even put it in our tools, but if not, it's so easy to get. And one of the quotes from her article is that white privilege is like an invisible knapsack. You have special provisions in that knapsack. You have maps. You have passports, code books, visas, clothing tools, and blank checks. You have invisible, weightless, even preferred access to opportunities that others do not have if you are white and others are not. Now, be careful. What I'm not saying is that it's automatic that you are prejudiced, or it's white prejudice versus privilege. This is something that comes to you and accrues to you simply by being white. Here's a little snapshot of the article itself, and it is a very interesting article, and I want you all to imagine something. When I do training sessions, and many, many trainers use this technique, to introduce white privilege, one of the techniques is contained in this article is to ask everybody in the audience to go against the back wall. Everybody go to the back wall. And as you read certain statements, then the individual that that statement relates to can take a step forward. If not, you have to stay in place. So I've taken some of the sentences or the statements out of this article. And I want you to visualize now a very diverse audience across the back wall of a training room, and you step forward if if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. If I should take a step forward or stay in place. If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and which I would want to live. Step forward or stay where you are. I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. Step forward or stay where you are. I'm just going to read two more. There are actually quite a few. There are 26 statements. I'm just going to read two more and let you think what would happen. When I am told about our national heritage and about civilization, I am shown that people of my color have made it what it is. And then I can be sure that if I need legal or medical help, my race will not work again. Take a step forward or stay where you are. Now, I want you to be thinking about what the room begins to look like as you read through these 26 steps. And that is the advantage of this entire activity. It begins to show you, and let's look at this definition, that white privilege is the right, advantage, immunity granted to, or enjoyed by white persons beyond the common advantage of all others, an exemption in many particular cases from certain burdens or liabilities. I think all we have to do is look at the news stories of the last year in the United States and looking at the tensions and the different positions that we hold if we're white versus black. And white privilege is really coming to the fore in terms of our ability to see the impact that it has on society. Let me tell you why I put this in and why this is very important. If we're not careful as educators, we have all kinds of reasons for children not doing well in school. And some of them that I hear include, well, you know, they live in that neighborhood, or their parents never come to the parent night, not realizing they have two jobs. Or, well, what could you expect? They don't really have any learning materials or a place to study in their homes. And so if we're not careful as educators, we allow others to propose solutions or reasons why we have a continuing achievement gap for children by race and culture. And that's not acceptable, and therefore that's why understanding this is so important. Because white privilege can establish you in a position of some tremendous advantage just in your lifetime. And so I put some of this material from Robert Jensen's book, Essential Readings on the Other Side of Racism, and it's really well done. But I also had some additional comments that come from this book. I want you to think about the practical advantage that's implied. On average, whites are more likely than members of racial or ethnic minorities to attend schools with smaller class size, to have access to computer technology, to earn higher salaries. And this is important when we've looked at the recent poverty studies, to retain employment during a downturn. The first people within an economic downturn, substantiated by the data, are minority individuals. Be covered by health care, health insurance, and spend a smaller percentage, whites spend a smaller percentage of their household income on their housing instead of an enormous percentage. So in the average, these characteristics are true. So we need to understand very thoroughly that a lot of the conditions or the situations about that gap in achievement are those that society over time has created. And it's not, the burden is not on the child, it's on the adults to address those disadvantages if they occur and build those up and provide them in the instructional setting. Now, this one is, this slide here is the third of my arguments with educators and others about why this is so important. And you see yet, I've not talked about one strategy in the classroom or of leadership. We have to appreciate what the cumulative effect of these dilemmas, or white privilege and cultural incapacity, present to children. Feelings of worthlessness, achieving less in school, lower rates of graduation and entrance into four-year colleges. There's a whole host of the results of this. We're going to talk about a few of them in just a few minutes. But as an individual, as an educator, as a human being, can we live with the fact that there's a negative impact to children? And the answer has to be no. So all of this added together is more about that we had to pay attention to self first before I would ever see that I would be as effective as I need to be in changing my practice. Changing practice is easy. Changing deeply held belief systems is very, very difficult. So I want to pause here and ask our audience, are there any questions about this first part that looks at attitudes and self? Any questions? Comments, even? I believe in instructional wait time.
So folks are welcome to use chat just to put in a question or a comment, or you could also press *6 if you want to ask your question directly to Dr. Stetson.
Well, I hope you'll have questions later. I will tell you this. I understand not having many questions in this regard. And the reason is that this is personal work. This really is an individual task that each of us has. It's just very, very powerful kind of journey. We'll entertain questions later, but in the interest of time, I will go on. And we're going to look now at some very, very practical, very clear ideas. Oh, yes.
I just want to interrupt you for a second. Tasha Woods has her hands raised, so maybe we can go ahead and hear from Tasha for a second.
Tasha, okay.
Tasha, you can press *6 and we can hear you.
And San Francisco typing.
What? Yellow in the bottom left. Yellow, oh. All right, got it. Oh. Okay, what do you do to support students? Oh, since changing adult attitudes is so difficult. Well, that's a perfect lead-in into the next part of the presentation because I will say this. You know, I still say we have to work on adult attitudes. But sometimes we have to look at, to have practices change and then the attitudes change later. And so that's a really great question that says, okay, what if you have adult issues or attitudes that don't change? Or in the midst of all that change, what can you do? All right. Well, then let me move forward in the presentation. And we're getting some more typing, so we may get some more answer. Linda made a comment earlier in the session that's very, very, very good. It requires personal work, but with systemic implications, because each thing that we do personally, we have to see replicated at a systems level. And so in schools, Linda, that's an excellent point. What do we do that then transforms that into something that the school system or the community system pays particular attention to? And so one of the things in my mind is giving time in faculty meetings and in small meetings for there to be deeper conversations, so that one system's response is time for people to process this. Oh, okay. And Tasha says, thank you. I was just going to make a comment. She said she's pleased that we're having this discussion. It must be addressed. Absolutely. That's really true, Tasha. And I'll tell you, these are difficult conversations. I've had to do personally, I will tell you, a personal growth area. This used to be so difficult for me because I was fearful that I would use the wrong words, or I would say African American instead of black, or Hispanic versus Latino, or white and Anglo, and I struggled and worried over all of those different terms that I would use. And it's taken me a while with my little comfort zone piece to realize that every culture uses multiple words to describe each other and themselves. And so I agree with you. It's important to discuss these issues and for us to think back for ourselves. Excellent. Good. Okay. Well, let's move on, and now let's look at some changes in the classroom. And I must say, they also still relate to attitudes as well as personal attitudes. So this is a quotation I love sharing with folks. Parker Palmer has written a number of wonderful books, but one of his is The Courage to Teach. If you haven't read it, you would really enjoy reading it. But this is my favorite quotation of his of all time because it talks about what our roles and responsibilities are. He says, teachers possess the power to create conditions that can help students learn a great deal or keep them from learning much at all. And teaching is the intentional act of creating those conditions. Now, a lot of teachers, most everybody, it'd be very rare that somebody goes into education for any other reason than they want to be helpful to children. I truly believe that and want the best for children. But we're now going to talk about some intentional acts that need to be in place in order for us to be really successful. We have to intentionally differentiate our instruction. We have to provide scaffolds or accommodations. We have to be sure that our curriculum is reflective of all the cultures that we serve and not just the predominant culture in the community. One of the biggest things that we're doing right now in education, as all of us would admit, is that there's a lot of focus and training now on student engagement. Can't just be the teacher talking at the front of the room and the kids falling asleep. There's got to be active learning. And so that's a characteristic that we need to consciously put in place. And flexible grouping, and you can read the rest. But I want to make the point. This is a powerful statement to make, and I'm sorry to say it so, but it is. Traditional classrooms simply are not effective anymore that are lecture-based, teacher-focused, more competitive structures versus cooperative learning. They're just not effective for the majority of our kids today. Any child, gifted, struggling, any child. And so this becomes a recipe on that slide. It becomes a recipe of the kinds of things practices that we need to put into place. So if we're not going to do that, one of the things we need to know and say is what should be in place. So for you, we put in a checklist that we had created for one of our online courses that we created in Cultural Proficiency. And you're welcome to have this. And it says, is this a common practice for you? Are you developing that practice, or you need assistance and need to further develop it? You might enjoy giving yourself a little self-survey with that. But another one of the tools we put in here is one that is a source from Pearson, and it's from Culturally Responsive Teaching. And there's some wonderful characteristics. It says teachers who are culturally responsive, for example, display images that might be familiar to the students. And there's a whole list of things here that take it to even a different dimension than the first checklist. So I think it's important to be able to see how other people describe culturally proficient teaching. And so these are here for you. But for us today, I'm going to pull out, and I brought strategies and tools for these 5 different approaches. They're absolutely necessary, in our belief, in creating inclusive environments and then significantly reducing disproportionality. So building authentic relationships, high teacher expectations, scaffolding, self-responsibility for learning, and positive behavioral support. So let's look at each one of those in greater depth. And we've provided you some tools for each one of them. This is a tool, Who Am I, that I found recently online. I think it's wonderful. This is not mine. It came from Chandra Manning. I love this. At the beginning of the school year, or it's never too late, whatever time of school year it is, and lucky for us, it's still September. This is a great little visual that kids can fill out with who I am, hobbies. I love this. What is your graduating class? Here are the high expectations also embedded in that. When's your birthday? Where have you lived? Just a whole lot of your favorite sports teams, so on and so forth. Favorite childhood memory. There are opportunities in this one little page over time or in a small interview session for teachers to individually get much better acquainted with their students. Now, I know if you're an elementary teacher, this is pretty simple. This is maybe your 25 students or 30, and then, of course, as you get into 5th and 6th grade, if you departmentalize, it's going to be more. Secondary, you may have to choose what parts of this are more important to you that would help build more of those relationships. But the idea here is we have to know these kids better than just their seating chart. We have to know them beyond what we're just assessing in terms of learning. Today, we have to make personal connections for students with their adults so that real learning occurs. And because I'm going to say the other reason. If I know a child personally and deeper than just where he sits or what his name is or maybe how he scored, what his reading level is, I'm going to relate very differently to that student because I've taken the time to know him better. Sometimes teachers from time to time call up students. They always have this available, call them up to their desk when they have a few minutes and say, well, let's talk about you. Tell me what you have on your chart. Other teachers may do it in a cooperative learning where every student fills it out in a small group, and then over the next several weeks the teacher sits with a small group and has them introduce themselves in terms of these questions. All different ways of doing it. If you're really into technology and your kids are older, you can put it on a spreadsheet and have them complete it and then do some tallies and have some trend data for your classrooms. The next two that we put in here is something we use in differentiated instruction. They're an elementary and a secondary version of a student interest survey that we find to be very, very helpful. I love learning is fun when. I like to get praise for. Sometimes I worry about. I love the question, number 13, I learn best when. We need to know those things as educators. Now, this is significant for our classrooms of diverse learners. And you see what it's doing in terms of creating that more authentic relationship with our students. So I think these are a very important kinds of checklists. This slide here I've put for you. I'm not going to read it. You can look at it yourself. But the reason I like these ideas that we present here are they take it to the next step is not just the authentic relationship with the student, but it's also how to create that classroom environment that is more culturally proficient, more culturally accepting, and also more inclusive. I want to keep using the word inclusive because obviously inclusive education is an overarching concept and practice across all of these. So this is important. One of the things that I've found in my work in cultural proficiency is that teachers must actually also be willing to self-disclose. Now, I'm going to say appropriately, but self-disclose, more of your own culture, more of your upbringing, more of the things that you are, that are a part of your learning and others that you still have to learn, things that you aspire to. So self-disclosure is a very important characteristic of a really effective teacher. Let me go back to this. There you are. The thing that this leads us to is another little checklist that we have. The top part is how to build authentic relationships with students, and the bottom part is with families. So these are a whole host of strategies for you. You're smart people out there, and you know and do many of these practices, and what our hope is that we brought you some ideas that might be new to you. I have a story to tell about authentic relationships. that was very instrumental in changing some of my own attitudes and approaches in terms of my own, not only my own teaching, but my own relationships with others. I had been invited, some years ago now, back when we were just starting to look at disproportionate representation at a federal level, and I was invited by Council for Exceptional Children under a contract for the Department of Ed to host a whole room full of members of the National Association of Black School Educators. And it was at their conference, they were there anyway, and they gave a half day for us to bring them in and put them into some focus groups. And the question to be asked to all of these groups from the National Association of Black School Educators was, what did they think the reasons, the predominant reasons for children being African American and minority children being disproportionately identified and placed in special education? Well, I'm going to tell you, it was like 200 people in the room. It was a very emotionally charged environment. There were a lot of ideas and strategies, and there was a lot of pain in the room as well. And I was feeling kind of down at the end of the day because it had been a really tough day, a great learning day, but a tough day. And as I was packing up my briefcase, I thought I was the only one in the room, and this really elderly African-American gentleman walked up to me and stood very quietly for a minute, and I said, "Oh, hi, yes, sir." And he said, "I just wanted to share one thing with you." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "I know I'm going to tell you what I think would make the difference." And in his quiet way, he said, if every teacher had developed an authentic relationship with each of their students, we would not have disproportionate representation. And, you know, those words just clanged in my head because I didn't even hear in those days, we didn't really hear the phrase authentic relationship either. So I started thinking about that, and I truly believe that gentleman was exactly right. The minute you start, and we start seeing our children through authentic, inclusive lens and seeing what they're about and who they are and what their hopes are, then what we do as educators is we continue to build those experiences and build our own teaching around the respect of the needs of those children. So I don't know the gentleman's name. I think he's wonderful, and I credit him with a major shift in my own work toward my own cultural proficiency. The second practice is surely related to authentic relationships, and that is high teacher expectations. Now, I'm just going to say truly that we have all the data and all the research we need to suggest that the average, if you look on the average, that teachers tend to have lower expectations for children on the basis of race or income. And a really good study, most recently, I have a study, something that was featured also on the PBS NewsHour. It was developed by, as the slide says, the Center for American Progress. And you'll want to Google this or search this and find it. But it shows that teachers expect students of color and low-income students to graduate college at lower rates than white students. Now, look how easy it would be to come up with reasons that blame the race or the child if you are at the low end of that cultural proficiency continuum. It's not my responsibility as a teacher. The children come with these characteristics. It's why that continuum is so important and white privilege is so important. Because these are attitudes. These are high or low expectations. So the teachers in the study thought that a college degree was 47% less likely for African American students than for their white peers. And we know that if that's what we expect, that's what we'll get. And for Hispanic students, 42% less likely. So this is a really powerful piece of the research that begs us as teachers to examine our own expectation levels. For example, do we ask the challenging questions of all students in our classroom, Or do we reserve those for the kids that we think are going to always have the right answer? We, and our own biases, think. Do we provide equal wait time when we ask students questions? Do we give them equally challenging work that communicate high expectations? Or do I inadvertently communicate lower expectations for some of my students? So this is an important question for every teacher to look at. And then, in keeping with what we talked about for this piece, there are actually some very practical kinds of things that we do that begin to communicate those high expectations. For example, giving every student throughout the course of the semester or the year more than one opportunity, I hope, to lead classroom activities. It's always the leader who sits in the front row and raises his or her hand. But do we give every child an opportunity? Do I look at my own practices? Do I encourage minority college students? Are college students with disabilities to serve as mentors or come and speak about their college experience? And so on. The rest of these are on the chart. But these are really important practices that communicate high expectations for children. I remember a visit to a classroom in Las Vegas in Clark County schools that was incredible. And the principal told me that her focus was to communicate accountability for learning for all students. And I've never seen, it was such a great school. Every child had notebooks that talked about where they were in their performance and what their progress, and setting charts for where they were going to get and what they needed to do in order to achieve that. And all the doors had pictures of the teachers, individual teachers' diplomas and T-shirts and hats and stuff, pennants, and stories about the teachers' college experience and so on. And it said, where would you like to go? And this was a middle school that had all kinds of pamphlets about colleges. The third piece is one I'm very passionate about because it's so darn simple, and yet we're often not using them, and that's scaffolds. When we look at scaffolding for our education, all of you know, and some of you may know this by a different word, instructional accommodations. In other words, they're the techniques or tools that teachers can use and provide to students that make their learning more efficient and more effective. It's not changing what the student is learning, but it's giving them ways to learn it more efficiently and more effectively. I'll tell you, my best scaffold is a graphic organizer. If I can build a chart of even the most complex scientific or historical event, I can understand it, remember it, be tested on it, and do pretty well. If I don't have something that's a visual reminder and a guide, and hear only the words, I will probably score very low on that same test question. So look at the definition of scaffolding. In the process of scaffolding, teachers provide supports that can be removed as the content and skills are mastered. So we stick with the learner objective, but you would in an animation see these scaffolds moving off of the slide because students no longer need them. I'm going to say this, in the hundreds of classrooms I visit every year, I am really chagrined because the best teachers know the answer to this question, and the poorer ones, the less successful, I'm going to say, the ones whose scores are lower and whose students are less satisfied and are learning less, you can see a difference in their use of scaffolding. I go in a classroom and one teacher says, I've provided an outline of the lecture for all of you, so it's easier to follow along. I might go to the next classroom and the teacher says, oh, I would never do that. They're supposed to read the book like everyone else. Just missed an opportunity to make learning that much easier for your students so they can then take it to deeper levels of application. A vocabulary bank. All of us that are teachers in this audience will say one of our biggest challenges today is having our youngsters have the depth of vocabulary that's needed. The problem with that is that we don't use strategies that make the vocabulary more obvious for students. A word wall, a vocabulary bank, flashcards with the words, study groups that look at vocabulary, so on and so forth. So what I want to say is if you look at plain vanilla instruction in a diverse classroom, you will see a higher percentage of students struggling and not performing well, not because of their own ability, innate ability, or their own capacity to learn, but because we're not providing them with the sufficient tools to make it easier to learn. To that end, we put a lot of tools in your packet that I'm not going to be reviewing with you, but here's a description of different types of scaffolds that might be helpful to you as teachers. We have, my favorite type is a graphic organizer, as I said. Here are some examples of how to use a graphic organizer. Most of you probably know this. Here is a visual schedule. This is one of our favorites that most of our participants really like. This is actually several pages long. It's titled, "If a Student Has Difficulty, Try This." And completing a task on time, or expressing him or herself verbally, or following directions. 4 or 5 page sheet is fantastic to use. And I'm going to say this, prior to any consideration of referral for special education, we ought to be, and most of us are, looking at pre-referral, or I don't even like to use that term because it means we are going to refer, at responses to interventions. So we look at interventions that we can use in the general ed classroom. Take a sip. Excuse me. I'm in Texas where there's dust. I guess I should mute so you all don't have to listen to me coughing. Okay. One more sip. The fourth one is student self-responsibility for learning. I observed this in a high school the first time. It was a low-performing school. High minority, high poverty, and they were blaming it all on that. And one of the things that I asked the teachers, do your students have the process skills they need in order to be successful in school? And the teachers thought a minute, and they said, no. I'm going to mute a minute so I can cough, and then I'll come right back. I'm sorry. I'm going to take my water. I don't know what. Yes. Okay. I'm going to Okay, I'm back. I know many of you had that happen to you as teachers, so we're going to keep going. Okay, this is really interesting. For example, this low-performing school, I was sitting there wringing their hands, and I said, do your kids have note-taking skills? Well, no, they don't do very well at that. Do they know how to study? Do they know how to organize for a test? Well, no. So this section is actually amazing because it is tremendously powerful if you as teachers ask these questions. And this is about all of your students. Do all of your students have the process skills in order to be successful at learning? Never mind the content. Can they access it? Are we explicitly teaching these process skills? And what will they need in order to go to the next level? Now, here's a little chart for one of the schools that identified note-taking and organizing for learning, etc., writing short essay answers. When I was working with that high school, they had an aha that ended up in a terrifically great idea, and I put it up on the screen for you. In the first several weeks of school, the various departments chose which of those process skills they were going to teach. The science department, the first couple of weeks of school, was going to teach how to take notes. The English department was going to teach how to write short essays. The social studies class teachers taught the study skills piece. And the math department taught graphic organizers. So that when kids rotated through their courses, they were able to achieve all of the, thank you, Alicia's bringing me a cough drop, right? Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I'm set now. and one of the things they did is they taught it the first week of school, they retaught it in January, and they went back for refreshers in March, and they incorporated it into their curriculum. I urge all of you to think, are we inadvertently penalizing our learners because they don't have the process skills or didn't have the opportunity to learn how to study? My mother was a teacher. So when I was probably 4 years old, she sat me down and taught me how to study. And many of us have that background with a parent that was a teacher or in some profession that's related. And many youngsters never had this instruction, and yet we're not formally teaching it in school. Okay. And then my last one is a characteristic that it seems so obvious, but let's think, what is often the route for minority children to arrive into special education? And what is the route for children with disabilities? What is the disability that is most often associated with exclusion rather than inclusion? And that is behavior. So I'm going to suggest that this is particularly relevant to our culture and our own idea of what's successful or appropriate in a classroom. Now, the majority of our teachers today do not resemble the classroom makeup. We have many white teachers teaching high minority percentages of students. Now, that's not a problem necessarily, although we would like to have the teaching faculty the same makeup as the student faculty, for sure. Student group is for sure. But all of our teachers can learn to monitor our own culture and make sure that we're not bringing our own cultural biases into a classroom and grading or evaluating students' behavior on a fairly traditional old mindset about what school looks like. For example, many of us have different behavioral norms in the classroom. If you are from different cultures have different norms that are acceptable for behavior. Noise level, the importance of having direct parent involvement. It is a real ding for some of our teachers. Well, the parents aren't here to conference with me at least once a semester. Well, they may not be available. It's not a ding against the child. It's a whole different dimension of today's society. The level of physicality in a classroom. I love to watch the difference in the hyperkinetic behavior of some of our youngsters who are simply just being themselves and take up more of the classroom and make a little bit more of the noise. It's part of their culture. And yet we have teachers who really narrow down and use their own culture. So the real important question, I think, is that are we making certain that we do not have more negative consequences and more stringent expectations for minority children? And in fact, the answer is we actually do. There are a number of studies. This last one mentioned on my slide here, really, I would love for all of you to look into that study if you haven't already. But what they found is that black students are disciplined more harshly than their white peers in U.S. classrooms, and that minority students are 3 times as likely as peers to be suspended or expelled than their white peers. Now pay attention to that. Inclusion, exclusion, Brown versus Board of Education, inherently unequal, separate education. And yet, disproportionately, our numbers of minority children are in those settings. So here's a whole point that I wanted to make by choosing this as my 5th practice that you really have to see in the classroom. And that is, do you believe as a teacher that there's no possibility of eliminating an inappropriate behavior for a student? Or do you believe that it's simply a behavior that if it's inappropriate, we can study it, we can look at what triggers that behavior, what is currently rewarding that behavior, what kinds of interventions we could use before the behavior could appear, All of those is a validated problem-solving process, and with a good chance of eliminating inappropriate behaviors. And I'm going to say another thing, to be sure that we're not identifying behaviors as inappropriate, when in fact they simply reflect different cultural behaviors in the classroom. I'm going to tell a story that happened last year that I cannot get out of my mind, and I would imagine most of you have unfortunately see this on more than one occasion in a school year. I believe that in any classroom that I walk into, after a while, I've been doing this for a very long time, some of our teachers, not all certainly, but a few of our teachers indicate rather quickly to any visitor and certainly to the students in their classroom that they don't like them, that they're individual students that they find lacking, that they'd rather they were actually taught by some other teacher. It is very damaging. Every kid in the classroom knows that message, and particularly the student or students that the teacher feels that way about certainly knows it. So I went into this classroom, it was a middle school, early grade, like 7th grade, 6th, 7th grade, and observed the teacher, and right away there was this precious kid, African-American student, and his desk was smashed right up front, right next to the teacher's desk, just smashed there. Everybody else was kind of off in their rows and so on, but this poor kid, like right under the desk. And when I walked in, the teacher was singling that child out, and she said, "All right," let's call him Johnny. "Johnny, remember, this is your desk. You stay in this desk. You don't move out of it. And I'm going to tell you another thing. If you have anything to say, I want you to raise your hand. If I don't see you raising your hand, I am not going to be able to call on you, so you must remember to always raise your hand. Do you have that?" Now, first of all, that was pretty demeaning conversation in the way that she said it and what she said in front of the entire class. So I'm immediately going, ouch. And so I'm standing there watching the instruction, and the teacher walks away from her desk out toward the rest of the class with her back to the poor kid whose desk is stuck to hers in the front of the room. And so she's lecturing about something, and she's asking children questions and kids questions, and this young man, John, he's got his hand up, and he's really excited, and you can tell he knows the answer, and he's got his hand up. And so she goes on for 10 or 15 minutes, and this child is, every time she asks another question, if he knows the answer, he's got his hand up, and I'm just in pain. I am pacing because she's got her back to this kid. She told him he had to raise his hand, and he's been raising his hand for 15 minutes, and she hasn't even known it. Finally, this little boy, in a fit of excitement, because he really knew the answer to the question, and knew she couldn't see him, jumped up and ran in front of her, and he had his hand up, and he said, "Teacher, I know this answer too." Well, you know what happened, don't you? The teacher said, "Johnny, I told you, raise your hand and stay in your seat. Now you've had it. You are going right now, collect your things, and go down to see the principal." And I'm standing there, and I'm just feeling this pain, and this kid, and he's so embarrassed, and he's trudging down the hall, and I was just beside myself. And so I waited until I finished my observation, and I decided that I would go down to the principal's office where this child was. And I called the principal out, and I said, "Excuse me, but I was in that classroom," and she knew who I was and why I was there, and we were looking for effective instruction. And I said to her, "You have the wrong person in your office. It's the teacher that needs to be in your office." Because this teacher was personalizing that behavior, was not looking at it from some level of structure, setting up situations for the child to fail. So this is a very important strategy, and I've put some pieces in here. I know 99% of us know this, but for some of us I don't think we do, because we wouldn't have the rates of disproportionate identification. So my honest truth is there is no quick fix. If there are behaviors that are present, we have to problem solve. We have to work toward that. so that we demonstrate that we have a belief in the student and that we have good and clear expectations. But I've got to say, I'm going to add another rule here, that we're fair and unbiased in our work with children, because that bias communicated to everyone. It was a rotten day. And so what I've brought to you is a reminder of a classic study called the Cradle to Prison Pipeline. It was done in Texas, ironically, my own state, and it talks about how you take my story about that young man, I could easily see him dejected, low self-esteem, embarrassed in front of his peers. I could easily see him on a pipeline to prison if he did not have someone who believed in him and a teacher who did not allow for own personal prejudice to enter the classroom. And so I wish that teacher didn't teach anymore. And I wish for all of us that we remind ourselves that we have a process that's clearly objective and a good problem-solving effort to identify what problems are posing the issue, behaviors are posing the problems, and what our hypotheses are and what we've tried. And the burden is on the adult, not on the student. The burden is on the adult teacher to find ways to correct that behavior. Now, I'm not saying that children are not responsible for their own behavior, but I want to say it needs to be a level playing field. So that's why this one is so important. Just recently, in 2012, the Association of Black School Psychologists wrote this phrase: overrepresentation of black or minority children in special education is a civil rights violation and a major culprit in the school-to-prison pipeline, with low teacher expectations yielding low-quality instruction, which in turn, so on. You can read this. So that's another reason why we spent the time on the adult issues before we could ever move to what we need to do in the classroom, because they're so tied together. So this is a great slide to conclude this part with. Thank you. This definition of cultural responsiveness. We have to have the will and the skill to form authentic relationships, result in effective teaching that ultimately closes the achievement gap. And I love this last phrase: culture influences the lens through which teachers teach and students learn. This is a magnificent summary, if you will, of a lot of what we've covered. Uh-oh. So, let's close this piece and say, are there some ways in which you can connect? What are some of the ways that you all in the audience connect with students to create an authentic relationship? Anybody have an answer to the question? And then I promise we'll finish really quickly. It's my fault, of course. I get excited about my topic. Anyone out there have an answer to that question?
So again, I noticed Tasha has her hand raised. Tasha, if you could try pressing *6, maybe this time hopefully we'll be able to hear you. Yeah, star, not pound.
You can hear me, I think.
Yay! Go ahead.
Yes, I actually love that this section has been brought up, because authentic relationships, for my background being a school psychologist, we would often always have to build rapport rather quickly with students. But teachers also, must learn to do that same thing, is build rapport. And I've had such great experiences with diverse learners that, when you're truly asking them questions about where they've traveled from and their own experiences, and you start sharing yours, at really no matter what age, that you start to feel that connection that you can build upon. So I really like to engage with students, and of course, like I said, being a school psych, you would have to definitely do that rather quickly. But teachers, I kind of envy them when they're able to continually build that relationship over time. So I think it's extremely important, you know, to have that authentic relationship with the kiddos.
That's a wonderful comment, and it's really, I think, one of the privileges of being a teacher is, as you said, we have the whole semester or a whole year to really build those authentic relationships that make such a difference. But I'm glad there are folks like you in the school psychologist position. All right. It's my fault that we're running a little over, so I'm going to pause and ask if there are any questions about the strategies that I've shared for the classroom, and then we're going to end really quickly with the administrative piece. Any questions at all about any of the 5 strategies? Okay. Well, I tell you what I think you're going to like is that you have them. We've given you all these tools, and we're happy to share anything else that you might need. All right. Well, let's quickly wrap it up with the last little part. It's the smallest part, is changes in leadership. We talked about changes in self, changes in classroom, changes in leadership. This is again from Heifetz and Linsky. I love this. If this wasn't a definition of leadership for inclusion and disproportionality, I don't know what is. Leadership is mobilizing people to make progress on the hardest of problems. And they're hard because they're personal, and they're hard because they're linked to our own culture and our own biases and thoughts. And administrators just need a great deal of courage. And we have to be able to bring up non-negotiables. A principal, in my opinion, has to be willing and able to say frequently, we are an inclusive school. We have high expectations for every student, and so on and so forth. And that any other behavior or practice is not aligned with our own school philosophy. I want to say, too, that administrators are really instrumental in all of this whole host of questions, that from pre-referral, response to intervention, all the way through IEP decisions. There are many opportunities for the leaders to say, wait a minute, I'm not sure this child should have been referred for special education. Or I'm questioning this. What other strategies have we tried? Where is the student successful? And we want children, far fewer children, to be identified for special education on the basis of what we can do appropriately in the general education classroom. So as we look at this, we need to disturb people, but at a rate they can absorb. As my teacher has talked about, we have to be willing to raise the heat in the kitchen. We have to bring these sometimes uncomfortable topics to the fore in order for us to make any progress. So the tools in this last section, we have designed some wonderful little activities that principals can lead their faculties through to build a shared responsibility or ownership for all students. So one is, they're both of them effective for elementary or secondary faculties, and I'd love for you to download these and take a look at those. So our last reflection question is, as we close, is think about what can educational leaders do to elevate the discussions that we've had today. What is their role? How can we do that? How can they raise the heat and how can they make it possible? Okay. Any questions? As we say, we've talked about intentional acts for all children, changes in attitudes and classroom and leadership. I'm available for any questions, but I want to thank all of you for choosing this webinar and this today. So thanks to all of you, and I'm available for questions for anyone that has them. No hands are up? Well, then it's been my pleasure. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Frances. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. As you know, after our presentations, we always like to send out a quick survey just to get your feedback and hear more about what you liked and what else you would like to see. I also want to thank San Francisco because that's the district that brought Frances to our attention, and that is often how we find folks that we want to introduce all of you to make sure that you're aware of their resources and their expertise. If any of you have someone that you're working with or that you've just heard about that you would love to hear more from, please feel free to recommend your thoughts and ideas to us. We do like to be responsive to what you're wanting to know more about. And again, thank you, Frances. That was wonderful. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their afternoon and evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.